Hello, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Martha Newell-Kinsman, a manager for federal policy at Ceres and your moderator for today's live-streamed Ceres 2020 event. Ceres is a sustainability nonprofit working with influential investors and companies from around the world on a host of global sustainability challenges, including water risk, both scarcity and pollution, the climate crisis, and deforestation. I would like to start today by saying that our hearts go out to all of those seriously affected by the global pandemic. And we're especially grateful to those on the front lines risking so much and working hard to ensure we all stay as healthy and safe as possible. I also want to thank each of you for participating. We realize that your personal and professional lives have been profoundly disrupted in ways really quite unfathomable even just a few weeks ago. But your commitment and courage shown by your participation today is truly inspiring. The generous commitment and support of our speakers and sponsors who have stood by us on this digital journey to reimagine Ceres 2020 is so appreciated and must also be highlighted. We clearly would not be here today without your essential support. Somehow, against the odds, we were able to transform our intended in-person convening into a digital program together. The profound commitment and conviction of so many to address the dual existential threats that are plaguing our global community is inspirational. Today's panel is titled The Conservative Case for Climate Action and Clean Energy. During this session, our panelists will build a better understanding of the universe of conservative efforts in climate and clean energy policy advocacy and explore specific examples of conservative policy engagements. Before we begin with today's session, I have just a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this session is being recorded. We will be providing all participants with a link to the recording shortly after its completion. If you have any questions, please enter them in the chat box that's located on your control panel. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the session. Please note that due to potential global bandwidth issues, we may experience some technical challenges. Unfortunately, this is beyond our control. If it does happen, the discussion will pause for about 30 seconds to allow for bandwidth to readjust. We want to thank you ahead of time for your patience in the event that such an issue arises. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Joining us today are Heather Reams, Executive Director for Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, Mark Fleming, President and CEO of Conservatives for Clean Energy, and Corey Schrodt, Chief of Staff for Congressman Francis Rooney, a Republican from Florida and co-chair of the House Climate Solutions Caucus. Thank you all again for joining. And I want to start with once again acknowledging our current situation and the fact that millions of Americans are out of work and struggling to pay bills, and more have now died from COVID-19 than the Vietnam War. The world is struggling to contain and manage a pandemic the likes of which we haven't seen in over a century. So with that backdrop, why is now an appropriate time to talk about climate and clean energy? And Heather, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here with Ceres, no matter if it's online or in person, an important topic. We've all been pretty captivated by what's happened with COVID with our own lives. My kids are right outside this door. We're working from home and using technology in new ways for sure. But as that new normal sets in, we've got to think about what's next. Where do we want our country to go? Was it appropriate to talk about climate and the urgency maybe 3-4 weeks ago? Maybe, maybe not. But now we're in a place where we need to chart a path about recovery, economic recovery. Americans need jobs, and they need good paying jobs all across America at every skill level in every district in America. So that's why clean energy can be that pathway. These aren't blue or red jobs. They're red, white, and blue jobs, and they're important. They give us energy security. They give us energy independence. They grow our economy, and it absolutely needs to be part of any platform moving forward in Congress. And Crest will be on the front lines asking for that in the next, in the coming days. We've put a letter forward, and we'll continue to advocate for that.
Yeah, and I think that point about jobs is so important. We're losing so many jobs right now, and we're talking about these markets that are being lost, but focusing on what's next, I think is really important. Mark, I'm going to pass it over to you if you have anything to add.
Yeah, Martha, thank you very much. And it's an honor to be on the panel today with Heather Reams, who's such a leader in the conservative clean energy cause in our country, and Corey, who works for one of the greatest members of Congress in terms of moving this issue forward. So, and thanks before I start as well to the Ceres team. When we started Conservatives for Clean Energy in 2014, we began partnering with Ceres and Allie and Brianna and Ryan and your team. Just outstanding to work with in our states. We're now in 5 states in the Southeast, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, and Florida. And, answer to the question, our messaging around this has been clean energy is a major part of the solution moving forward. I think we have a very forward-looking kind of message, and we have had for years. And I think as Heather said, as we move forward, as we move out of this and into the next discussion, I think, anytime we can message around clean energy is an important component of this. We're not the only component, but we're an important component in moving America forward. I think that's our sweet spot at this point, at this point in time.
Yeah, and Corey, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's an honor to be here and on this panel and just be among some great folks in this community. It's a growing community, and without the folks here, Heather, Mark, and Martha, and the Ceres team, these facilitating these conversations is so important right now, especially among conservative folks. I think I would have to echo everything here. The next piece of legislation that you're going to see, we've done the immediate response, we've done the midterm response, we've done all the things necessary to make sure that people are protected, are in their homes, are not going to be kicked out of their homes, that sort of thing. The next step is figuring out how to reopen the economy, and jobs is going to be a big part of that. And there is absolutely no reason why these high-tech, new energy source and clean source and different types of jobs and infrastructure jobs shouldn't be a part of this conversation. I think it's going to be absolutely critical. I think you're going to see a lot of voices come around it in the next couple months. And regardless of what you think about energy policy or whatever, if you're going to look at infrastructure as a possibility for one of the components of this this rehab bill, it's going to have to include just planning for the future, whether it's sea level rise, whether it's population density, whatever it is, it's going to have to take those things into account. And I think that that's absolutely critical for us to be a part of that conversation and help drive that in the right direction, where our government is thinking about those things and planning for those things and constructing projects appropriately.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I'm thrilled that we have people like you and your boss on the Hill to lend a voice to these conversations as we're working on rebuilding our economy and rebuilding after this crisis. And Corey, you especially know, being on the Hill, that it's been hard to get some conservatives to accept that climate change is a concern at all, never mind something that needs to be addressed. So how have you seen the climate conversation among conservatives evolve over the last few years?
Yeah, it's really been impressive, the change in attitude towards at least being able to have the conversation and say the words climate change and accept the fact that we're seeing CO2 levels that are unsustainable, that we're seeing sea level rise that threatens our, for us it's beaches, for Norfolk it's bases, it's wherever you are, it's something different. In the Midwest it's flooding. It's really been hopeful to see how the conversation has turned from is it or isn't it climate change to, okay, how do we tackle this problem? How do we actually address it with conservative pro-growth policies? And I think that that's going to be a very drawn out and well fought battle, but I'm happy that we've at least moved into that stage of what to do, not do we need to do anything.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's an important point, that we have at least reached that place where we can say the words climate change in conservative circles and not be kicked out of the room. Mark, I want to pass it over to you.
Yeah, I agree with what Corey said there. And when we started Conservatives for Clean Energy, in 2014, we were careful not to mention the word climate or to mention the word environment. In fact, we avoided all of that and stayed in the clean energy lane exclusively. And while that's still our lane, we had to acknowledge over the last couple of years that the conversation is changing, even among really hardcore conservatives. So we put this year in North Carolina, for the first time, we do an annual energy poll, and we've conducted this now for 6 years. We put a climate question, and the question was just straight up: do you believe that humans are causing climate changes in our climate or not? And it was like 65-28 among North Carolinians in a purple state that said yes. And so then we drilled down further and looked at Republicans, and it was 42-45. So 42% of Republicans said yes, climate is human caused, 45% said no. So that split, right now, that's probably about right. We're at an even split. Just on that issue alone, not drilling down into specifics for policy, but just overall, looking at it. Then in Florida this year, we launched our Florida program in 2019. And our Florida team, I went into it with the same kind of let's avoid climate at all frame. And our Florida team said, look, if you're going to do clean energy work in the state of Florida, you've got to talk about climate. So we polled on it. And again, 2-to-1, 2/3 of the voters in Florida said that hurricanes are being called more, devastating weather events are being caused by a changing climate. So, I do think there is a lot of movement on this issue, and it's been helped by the leaders on the right who are talking about this, both in Washington and in states. And it has to be, for us to make progress on this, and I know we'll get into this a little later, it has to be authentically conservative, and the solutions that we work on have to be from the right, have to be. So we'll get into that later. But yes, I've certainly seen the conversation evolve on the right on climate.
Mark, I just have a very quick follow-up question. Have you noticed any sort of generational differences, or have you gotten into the data on that front?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I mean, the younger and the swing voter demographics, in that same poll, in purple states like North Carolina, both parties are interested in going after the unaffiliated voter, because these new younger voters that don't identify with political parties on either side, very independent in nature. These are the folks that decide elections in purple states like North Carolina and in Florida. And the polling is off the charts on climate. The same question that I just referenced in the North Carolina poll. Unaffiliated voters were at 62%. State as a whole is at 65%. So the unaffiliated voters are tracking not just on climate and clean energy, but on any issue. They're now the mainstream of the state, these younger, unaffiliated voters. So yes, it is generational, and we're seeing more and more of that as we look at numbers.
Wow, thank you. Heather, how have you noticed the climate conversation changing?
In Washington, as Corey had said, it's changing quite a bit. And it's leaders like Francis Rooney who have been engaging for some time in his personal life and in his professional life as a member. And he'll go off into the sunset when he's no longer a member, and I'm sure continue to engage on this really important issue. A couple of pieces, Mark talked about the authenticity of being a Republican. I think there's this thought that if you're going to engage on the right for some time, if you engage on climate, that means you want to dismantle capitalism in some way, and that's just not the case. So many of the solutions we have seen about climate change have indeed come from the left, and you will see a more heavy-handed approach, meaning government mandates and more prescriptive than what Republicans are comfortable with. So I think getting over that hurdle and recognizing that there can be free market solutions to engage on reducing emissions. There can be targets, there can be goals, there can be public-private partnerships. So that authenticity is really important. There are members who members of Congress who have been conservationists for a long time and have just steered clear of the words climate because they're concerned it paints them in a too moderate or leftist center position. So they've steered clear of that. So the semantics mattered in some way, the vernacular mattered. Unfortunately, we're seeing some of that dissolve. And I think politically, the other flavor of Republican, maybe they weren't engaging at all, but they recognize that the political writing is on the wall. There are young voters, the 18 to 35 demographic, for instance, who say they thought they were Democrats because they believe in climate change, but in every other aspect, they were fairly conservative. So that's a problem for a party that's trying to grow its base. And finally, politically, we know it's 50+1 to win elections. And if that all important independent voter, swing voter is critically important. Anyone who does campaigns knows this. So that's got to be shored up as well. But I think, why we're talking about this now, I think it's also work that groups like mine and Mark and others are talking about. We're talking about it from a lens of jobs. We're talking in the case of economic security, national security, preserving our lands, our waters. These are pretty conservative principles. As a lifelong conservative, I don't have any problem with these. I think it's how we're talking about it too. So we were approaching a time right before COVID. Unfortunately, the Republicans were starting to put out some ideas, some plans about how they wanted to begin to engage on reducing emissions and addressing climate change. I won't say it was comprehensive, because I don't think anyone was trying to say it was, but it was a start. We want to get back on that track somehow. And as I said at the beginning, talking about clean energy as part of all of the above. Energy generation is really important. I think that's where conservatives are comfortable and want to continue the dialogue.
Yeah, and I think that, like you mentioned, right before the pandemic really hit, we had this package from Leader McCarthy with some of the other conservative leaders in the House to address some climate change issues and deforestation. And that was a good first step, I think, for the party as a whole. So it sounds to me like the message of moving conservatives toward embracing action on climate change is one of kind of cautious optimism, where the party is starting to make strides, but there's still more work that we need to do, kind of drive the party and drive conservatives toward taking action. So something that we hear a lot in Republican circles is this idea of an all of the above energy policy. I think that was included in Leader McCarthy's package, that we need to embrace an all of the above energy policy for the country. So within Republican circles, what does all of the above energy mean? And Heather, I'm going to punch it over to you first.
Yeah, I did mention that too. So all the above, and everything's on the table. We're not, I think a realistic approach is where Republicans see that. So there are some, I'm sure plenty listening, watching right now, who would say we need to keep it in the ground. We should not be using any other fossil fuels. And for the most part, that's just a non-starter with Republicans. So I think to say that it's fossil fuels are included for a period of time, it's fair to say when you hear all the above. But it also is renewable and clean energy. It's nuclear, it's wind, it's solar, hydro, geothermal, and anything else that's going to come up, any other inventions and innovation. Everything is on the table. I think where we need to focus, put lead on the target, if you will, is reducing emissions. You have not seen dates and targets coming out of Republicans yet, but you are starting to see 2050 overall as this target. And I think we've got to work towards that. We've got to figure out that that's the goal, and how do we get there with an all the above platform and goals to reducing emissions over time. I think that's where Republicans are going to say yes. When you're starting to say when Republicans hear, we're anything but fossil fuels, you can't be heard anyway. So, but also, and some of my friends on the left will say all the above means nothing but fossil fuels and very little on the renewable energy. And concerns with this administration that we would see less of renewable energy. The Department of Energy has been pretty fair about its growth in clean energy, particularly renewable energy. It's doing it a different way than the previous administration. But part of our work is making sure that the all of the above walk is also, it's talk and walk at the same time. We want to see it all happen simultaneously.
Yeah, and I think that it is somewhat misconstrued when you talk, with people left of center about all of the above. It kind of comes across as, or seems to be mistranslated as fossil fuels first, and then whatever else we can add in from there. Corey, do you have anything that you'd like to add in?
Sure, and I think I can even flavor that a little bit. When I started on the Hill in 2011, 2012, in a lot of ways, all the above did mean just that. It was a refocusing on in certain Republican circles. It was a swipe at subsidies to wind and solar. I think that's really shifted as you see companies become leaders like Shell and how they're talking about becoming an all of the above energy company. They're really putting that focus on, okay, we see that the long-term growth sector is not going to be in oil and gas. If you look at Woodhouse Mackenzie predicts that peak fuel demand is going to be somewhere around 2035, peak oil demand a little bit later, maybe closing in on that 2040 range. Shell and other companies are starting to recognize that long-term, they're going to have to transition, whether it's public pressure, whether it's government pressure, whether it's just finding cheaper ways to produce energy than having to find a literal black gold mine at the bottom of a mile-long deep water trench and just hope for the best. I know their science is a little better than that, but it's definitely a diversification of their portfolio. I think those conversations are going to help move the general Republican and conservative sphere of thought to actually accepting what all of the above means, and that is being able to accept where we can put in solar and wind and bolster our network. I think that you're going to see a shift to conversations about nuclear. You're going to see conversations about natural gas as being a cleaner bridge from here. If the goal is carbon neutral by 2050, that gets thrown out a lot. We can't go there tomorrow. We can't go there 5 years from now. But what we can do is burn some cleaner fuels between now and then to at least mitigate some of our emissions. I think it's going to include all of those things, and I think that the conversation has hit a turning point where it truly does mean all of the above and not what some people previously had mislabeled it as.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned, peak oil. I read an article, I think it was in Axios yesterday, about and I don't remember who wrote it, but it was saying that we may have already reached peak oil because of this crisis, that oil demand may be dropping already instead of waiting until 2035, 2040. It may have sped up that timeline. Mark, do you have anything that you'd like to add in?
Yeah, just briefly, our work with state policy, what we have seen is, in the Southeast, it's about solar. In the Midwest, a lot of wind battles, right? So you tend to divide along fault lines there on pro-solar, anti-solar, or pro-wind, anti-wind. What we've tried to do is build alliances with those, even who might be perceived as anti-solar or anti-wind, around other technologies. So maybe it's electrification that they're interested in, and EVs, and moving that technology forward. Those kind of things, the more we can be as a movement on the right working on these things, the more we can add to our numbers and make clean energy not one specific technology, If someone doesn't like one, we'll take their help on another. Or maybe they like energy efficiency and think we need to be doing more with state-owned buildings, and that is an ally. So we don't look at folks on the right if they don't fall into a litmus test on every single issue. They're not one of us. We can find something for most anybody, and we found the more you can get advocates, policymakers thinking of themselves as clean energy advocates in a broad sense, that helps us on specific legislative battles, because then they begin to think of themselves as pro-clean energy. And just that psychology we've seen in a lot of our states. Just to have a broad view of clean energy and bring in allies on any technology, look for allies and amplify them anywhere we can find them.
Yeah, and I think that regional outlook is important. When I think of Florida, I think solar. When I think of the Pacific Northwest, I think hydro. So, really breaking it down by those regions and what's going to be the most available resource, renewable resource there, I think is a really good point. So we have a lot of businesses on the line who are interested in engaging policymakers on clean energy and climate action. So when you're talking with Republicans and conservatives, what messages seem to work best when you're trying to engage them in the climate conversation? And I guess conversely, what messages have you seen that absolutely don't work? And Mark, if you want to lead off with this.
Yeah, I mean, we've done quite a bit of work around this messaging, again, in states in the Southeast. And, what works, economic messages, that is a huge driver with policymakers. We found, talking about the jobs created in clean energy, we have quite a story to tell. I know in solar in the Southeast, we have an amazing story to tell. The more we get that out, the more helpful that is to our cause. What works? A creation care message we found works in several of our states. We did a poll in South Carolina in 2019. 91% of the respondents said, yes, we have a duty to take care of God's creation as it relates to climate. And we specifically put the word climate in. 91% of South Carolinians, arguably one of the most red states in the country. So that message works. Anything around market-based solutions, when conservatives hear market-based solutions, all right, we'll listen to you. We'll have that discussion. We might not always come out at the same place, but we can have that discussion. I think what doesn't work is anything that is viewed as alarmist. Any kind of message, if I were to sit down with a Republican legislator and say, look, we have 1 year or 18 months to solve this, or we're going to be in real trouble, they would laugh me out of the office, right? So we have to, nothing alarmist on the right, and anything on the right that's perceived as top down, anything that's of Washington and, we're going to do a clean power plan kind of approach, it really struggles on the right. And so it's a little bit of what we've seen in terms of what works and what doesn't.
Thank you. Heather, anything you want to add in?
Yeah, I agree with what Mark said. I'll also say there's so many, having been at the Ceres conferences and talked to so many of the sustainability officers of the corporates that you have, I learn a lot. But one is there's demand from consumers. They want their brands that they utilize to be cleaner, to be responsible stewards of the environment. So not only is it on the generation side, but it's the usage side. And having competition, by the way, about who can be cleaner. Hey, that's music to a conservative's ears. That there is a voluntary market-based demand and approach is really important. So I think it's why you're getting there. I think the other piece is also, are you making money when you're doing it, or are you losing? What does that mean? In addition to just the jobs on the generation side, but the demand that it's creating from consumers. And then, what's not working. I agree with the alarmist piece of it, and recognizing that Republicans are new to this, right? Overall, I mean, we'll say Republicans are new to talking about climate as a group. And it's important to be able to be credible and be in the room and have a conversation. So I know some are saying it's not enough. You have to push. We have to have that urgency, because there is urgency, and that's right. But there is urgency, but how much, and can we take something rather than nothing? And we've got to build the goodwill. We've got to get members comfortable with legislating on reducing emissions in some way. They have to understand the different arguments. And I think the corporate message and messenger is really important in coming to Washington or in states about what's possible.
Thank you. Corey?
Yeah, I have to agree with both Mark and Heather. It's about having these conversations that are about market-based, that are pro-growth, that are not alarmist. I mean, what happens if you put forth an alarmist argument? We fully understand the direness of the situation, but there is a natural reaction to just look at, okay, well then if that's the case and this is already going to happen and we're all, the coast of Florida is going to be underwater by next year, then let's just triage, let's build more seawalls and let's raise things up. And those aren't solutions. Those are probably going to be parts of what we have to deal with moving forward. But there's a much broader conversation here about, okay, what do you do in the short term and what do you do in the medium term, and then long term you want to be carbon neutral, and you have to figure out those steps, and alarmism can kind of complicate those conversations. The other thing I would say is positive examples. Anytime you can bring up a company that's been successful in converting talent from one industry to another, anytime you have injected innovation into the industry and been able to streamline or make something more efficient, whether it's power delivery, power production, or power consumption, you're not only talking about the case for reducing carbon footprint, but you're also talking about a lower bottom line. If you're costing less to use your electricity because you have automatic lights that shut off, I think that when you start looking at those types of overhead costs, they make a big deal when you extrapolate them across a large company. Those types of scenarios and concepts that you can bring and show, here's where we've had success, we want to expand on the success, or we want to try this new path that we think can be highly successful. Those are going to really grab attention of folks in Congress.
So it sounds to me like there are a lot of messages that do work, and the major thing that we want to stay away from is this alarmism message, and there's nothing that we can do to change the path that we're on.
And there's a difference between alarmism and urgency. I think I think Heather, you spoke to that a little bit. There's very much a difference of the ship is sinking, we're all screwed, and hey, we need to really take this seriously and start addressing this. Otherwise, our kids, our grandkids are not going to be able to live in the same type of world that we do.
I'll also add just the term now, it's becoming so polarizing. Green New Deal is tough. And anything can be, we have to be clear about what is the Green New Deal and what isn't. And asking for an extension for an ITC or PTC for wind or solar, or an inclusion of energy storage in that tax credit is not the Green New Deal. And there has been some conflation there, unfortunately. So I think it's, being common sense, having that urgency, not, avoiding those labels of, and the willingness to have a conversation. I think also corporates putting their priorities. I mean, when you go in, you're a large corporation, you've got a lot of different things to talk about. So how can you prioritize that amongst a lot of other requests? And that's soul searching for the corporates to decide what they want to do. But if someone's going in and talking to Corey and saying we need to do something, but they've got the wrong messenger and they don't come in very often, it makes you wonder of how sincere the corporation is. So you need to make sure you're balancing your your asks and recognizing how you're pushing is what I've been seeing.
Yeah, and if I could add to that too, you know, one of the things Ceres does such a great job with in our North Carolina program and in Virginia is working with, you know, getting corporates to come to the table, and these are the job creators in our state. So Ceres does such a nice job of plugging in the job creators with the policymakers and really helping to make that connection. But one of the challenges is always, you know, a company may have 10 things on their list. Here are the 10 things that we want to get done in Raleigh or in Richmond or in Atlanta this year. Here's our list. Well, sustainability and clean energy and climate goals may be on that list, but is that the thing that your government affairs expert is mentioning to policymakers? Because if everything is important, nothing is important. And so to go in and say, this year, the two, you know, we're going to make this one of our top 2 issues, whatever that is, whether it's utility reform or whatever the specific issue in the broader context of clean energy and climate. You know, just getting the government affairs, getting that not just on a leave behind with 10 other things, but this is the number 1 thing, or at least the number 2 thing that we want to accomplish this session.
So that kind of leads me into my next question. So with something topical for Ceres, next week on May 12th and 13th, Ceres is bringing over 175 businesses now together for a virtual Hill Advocacy Day called Lead on Climate. So when we're thinking about this effective messaging and advocacy, what can be done to leverage the sustainability and climate objectives of the corporate community to engage conservative policymakers, especially in the climate conversation? And Corey, I'm going to start with you because I think somebody in your office is probably going to have one of these meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, we hear from folks constantly, and I'll tell you what really holds, every office is different, of course, but one of the things that always tends to catch ears is jobs and economy and local issues. It's amazing how environmental the most conservative member of Congress can be when it's something that affects their district directly. When you bring in examples of, you know, for us, it's shellfish beds being polluted by dirty water, and our shellfish farmers being pressured to go out of business because we had a bigger than normal red tide a couple years ago. Whatever it is, local issues get a lot more attention. You know, long term, my goal would be to try and expand that brand for the member to be more nationally thinking, globally thinking. But man, if you can get those local issues to them, and especially if you can tie it in with jobs and the economy, it really gets the attention of a lot of folks. You know, for us, it's really easy. We have a tourism economy. So we need our beaches clean. We need our Everglades clean. We don't like dirty water. If you're talking to a farmer in Iowa, the floods a couple years ago were absolutely devastating, wiped out crops, wiped out I-29, and you couldn't get from Kansas City to Omaha. Droughts out west. The issues can always be brought back home and local. The solutions may look a little bit different, but the more you can drive them towards some kind of economic pro-growth and taking care of your district, the better.
Thank you. Heather, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just say, localize is definitely true. I think the polling also helps. You've got more than the anecdotal stories or specifics. You also have to recognize which committees a member may be sitting on, and having that lens of that gives him or her more of a national lens and looking if they're sitting on a relevant committee. I still find in reading articles about corporations that are able to bring in sustainability goals in the C-suite and how they've integrated that is really impressive. as kind of at the top why they're doing it. It's not a talking point that's leave behind. It really is part of a priorities. And then localizing it, I think is just really incredible to see that, or to talk about the potential for growth in a district is another way, preserving the jobs, but also the growth and what could happen. The growth that's already there, you're scaling up and that already in that district, or the potential for growth because of the dynamics that are there. I'll also say, talking about the regional energy pieces, whether it's hydro in the Northwest, solar in the Southeast, wind in the Great Plains. I'm not trying, when going into an office, if it's Iowa and it's a big wind and biofuels, I'm generally not going to talk about the expansion of hydro or solar as my leading talking point. You've got to kind of hunt where the ducks are and recognizing who you're talking to, and meet them where they are, recognizing where that member is. And that does not mean your talking points are laminated. It means that every member is going to have slightly different talking points. That should have them if you're really going to be effective in speaking on the Hill.
And I'll just add, I'm sorry,
go ahead.
I'll add quickly to that. One of the things we found is the local site visits. We have done really, we've seen great things from getting members and staff out to clean energy projects in their district. To Corey's point, that really, really helps if it's something in their district. And so the more we can make that tie, I'm speaking here as a former district director for a member. So, the more, don't forget district staff, the district and the state staff, because those folks have, a huge influence as well, and to connect local, clean energy projects with the member in their district or their state is important.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on this? Okay, Corey, it looked like you were going to say something. I didn't want to cut you off. So we're going to go into a couple of audience questions. What is your position on the need for federal or state policy on carbon pricing? So I guess we can start with the federal side. Corey, if you want to start off.
Yeah, sure. Great question, because Congressman Rooney has actually authored a carbon tax bill. Our big focus has been you need to find a way to offset it in order to be at least not negatively impacting economic growth. What our particular option does that we wrote would offset payroll taxes on both the employee and employer side. There's some other proposals out there to repeal the motor fuels tax, the highway tax, and use the money to actually fund infrastructure projects, which, considering there's so much conversation around infrastructure for the past couple of years, it would be a really unique way to actually pay for those sorts of things, which is more than I think can be said for a lot of the other ideas. I don't think that there's been too many solid funding proposals. And then of course there's the dividend model. Some of the economic policy models don't bear it out as being as friendly as some of the other proposals, but it still can be a very effective solution to this problem. I think the thing that scares folks the most is, especially in that model, what happens if the government starts getting their money on more and more of that pot of money. So I think that the big key is making sure that whatever it is, it's got to be protected and made sure that whatever is decided upon is the actual end use of the money. However it's injected back into the economy, it's going to be very important to make sure that that's safe and that stays that way, so that we have a reasonable expectation of where our money is going to go.
Thank you. Heather, do you have anything to add for the federal side?
Yeah, I also, this is a pretty tricky issue in talking about a carbon tax for conservatives. First of all, it's a tax. So TAX doesn't go over very well with conservatives. So messaging's terrible. But also, it's just right now, with respect to Mr. Rooney, there are no other sponsors on the right on this bill. And there's been just a few over the years that have sponsored this bill or some version of a carbon tax, price on carbon. So I think it's the political feasibility of moving forward. There are a lot of places to, a lot of low-hanging fruit that we need to go and grab. In thinking about the stimulus package, what that may be, we have a terrific energy package that came out of a bipartisan bill that came out of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. We have a very good-looking, it's not good-looking, but bipartisan, meaning it's politically viable, out of EPW in the Senate as well, with Carper and Barrasso, and talking about infrastructure. And even a hearing today looking to expand that into some water issues as well. So we have some places to go to develop that can get the economy going now, waiting for the perfect political makeup for a carbon tax to work. I mean, it just hasn't happened. And if we are talking about that urgency, we are talking about how much time we have to be realistic about what's the art of possible. And a carbon tax is not it. But I mean, there are plenty of my friends out there on the right that are in favor of it. So I don't want to pour cold water over their hopes and dreams, but our organization is focused on what's the art of possible right now.
And I want to come back to talk about some of that low-hanging fruit and the climate packages. Yeah. But first, I want to go over to Mark to talk about the state side, and if you think that there's any room for movement on carbon pricing at the state level.
No, I really tend to echo Heather's comments on this. The whole carbon tax conversation, when you say tax to a conservative, that's just a non-starter. I do think there is real room for us on the right to educate about carbon pricing, some kind of how do you put a price on carbon? I think that's step one. How would you go about doing that? I think the conversation's good. I also think it's helpful on the right. Pre-COVID, we saw media about different folks in the right having different solutions on the issue, and I think that's actually helpful. So it's not a monolithic, here's where the right is on this. I think there's room for discussion and debate, and I think that actually helps us in the long run to have different conservatives position different ways on this issue. I think is helpful.
That's a brief follow-up question. How do we differentiate between a price on carbon and a carbon tax? And I'm going to go to Mark just because you kind of use both.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the carbon pricing discussion has to come first. And how would you do that? I think that's a safer space to be in. Let's discuss how you would price carbon, and then sort of the policy prescriptions would come next. But I think it's, anyway, the way to intro that, I think, with conservatives would be helpful to have that introductory conversation before we move into the specific possible solutions.
Sure. So I want to go back to some of Heather's comments on those bipartisan packages out of Senate ENR and EPW. One of the other audience questions that we got was, when do you think we'll see a bipartisan climate package in the US? And will it actually be enough to address the problem? So I don't know how familiar you are with those bills, but if you want to kind of take a first stab at this question.
Is that for me?
Yeah, please, sorry.
Okay, sure, got it. So some would say that those two bills alone aren't enough, right? So a comprehensive bill, when that could happen. I think that's the beauty is in the eye of the beholder about what that looks like. Are we on a pathway to 2050 and you want the whole enchilada, or we got to build on something and you're hitting more singles and doubles? I'm under the illusion, but I believe that it's going to be a lot of singles and doubles over a period of time. We've got to start someplace, and those are two very good bills. I don't think there's been research on it about its effects of the carbon reduction. But for the first time in a bipartisan bill out of EPW, which is Senator Barrasso is the chair out of Wyoming, which is a cold state. There's a climate title in there. There's a meaty climate title in there. So, and Barrasso himself has said, climate change is happening and humans have something to do with it. He's coming from a cold state. He's also really big on carbon capture, sequestration, and utilization, and putting a tax credit for that and advocating that a lot of Republicans are in favor of. So they're looking for avenues to and all the above, going back to that. I think we've got to, on the energy package coming out of ENR, we're looking at, part of it is innovation, part of that is modernizing the grid. What's not the like? We know that's part of the solution. Is it everything? It's not. It's not. I mean, what we need to do for electrifying our fleets, for instance, on the transportation side, there's a lot, and sector by sector we go through this. We know there's a lot, but my goodness, we've got two well-vetted bills that have been made in order before all the chaos and craziness of COVID that has turned our country, our world upside down. And when we had cooler heads over a period of time, we had members of the Senate, bipartisan, passing two bills out of committee, full committees, and saying this needs to move forward. So I think that's an excellent place to start.
So that was a lot on the Senate, and I am personally partial to the House. So I want to go over to Corey and ask if you have seen anything, or if you think there's a space in the House for a bipartisan climate or energy package.
As far as some kind of comprehensive package, I think it's going to be very difficult. I think that these are all pieces of a very, very large puzzle. Even a carbon tax is not, I would not even consider comprehensive. It does not significantly impact the transportation world, which is right now the number, well, maybe not right now, but over the past couple of years, it has taken over as the #1 emissions producer. So I think that you're going to have to be looking at a lot of different pieces of how do you get people off the roads that don't necessarily need to be there? How do you get trucks in a space where they are more efficient? The amount of miles that go on trucks and heavy freight that travels the country is just absolutely astronomical. And when you raise the fuel mileage rates, 1 mile per gallon, 2 miles per gallon, it makes a big difference. So if we can really move the needle on that, whether it's electrified trucking, anything like that, I think it would go a long way. Maybe some of this can take care of itself in this era of COVID. If we come out the other side and more people are teleworking, more offices see it as, more companies see it as an opportunity to lower overhead costs of having to keep people in one building and pay for the HVAC and pay for the lights to be on and that sort of thing, and can instead keep people home. I think you'd see a huge downward driving force on the transportation sector and on building emissions. These are all different pieces. They aren't going to all require a policy prescription. I think that right now the environment is, the climate of Congress is going to be very difficult to, as partisan as Republicans and Democrats can be, the differences between the House and Senate can sometimes be even bigger. So I think that the House is a little behind on where they wanted to be from a majority perspective as far as their climate plans. And I think that it'll be until they get that out before they start looking at the more the individual puzzle pieces and how to move those forward. So I think that that's going to be a little bit, I don't know if it'll even get done this year in the current environment, just because of lack of hearings and lack of meetings. I know that the Climate Select Committee was supposed to put out some recommendations. Certainly, Energy and Commerce put out a few proposals last year, but I think until you see something that the Democrat Party can pick up as their piece moving forward, I don't think you'll see the smaller pieces of the puzzle fall into place.
Yeah, and we're running low on time. I just want to give Mark a quick minute if you have anything that you want to add in.
The thing is to know what you don't know. So I yield to the federal panel experts on this.
Well, maybe at some point we can have the House and the Senate come together and bridge that gap that somehow has formed in the Capitol.
Martha, I'll say this, I did focus on the Senate, and of course, the Senate is the majority is Republicans. But been talking our conversation about meeting members where they are, getting Republicans to engage. I just feel like it's a first place to start, and getting that goodwill. I will say I'll be remiss. My team would be remiss if I didn't mention we're starting a campaign called Clean Energy Forward today, kicking it off. It's cleanenergyforward.com, but it's geared towards talking to Republicans about the value of clean energy to reignite that conversation. So I think where Republicans have a comfort level is a great place to start, and create some certainty for a market that desperately needs it. So I'm going to still say let's move those Senate packages forward and get some accompanying bills in the House.
Yeah, and thank you for plugging your cleanenergyforward.com.
Yes, cleanenergyforward.com.
Great. All right. Well, I want to thank all of you for taking part in today's session. Before we adjourn, I want to take special note to thank all of the sponsors that you see on the screen who have provided instrumental support for Ceres 2020. Please note that you will receive a follow-up email with a recording of this session shortly. For those of you who are part of Ceres 2020, another session will take place tomorrow, Thursday, May 7th at 2 p.m. Eastern on state leadership amidst the climate crisis, innovations, and collaborations. To register and to learn about our other upcoming sessions, please go to www.ceres2020.org. Thank you again to our panelists, and thank you to our audience. This session is now adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.